Asia Pacific has been our last region to penetrate. So, being a company of European origins, our major presence and area of activities have traditionally been in Europe, North and South America, and in Africa. And so Asia was, for us, very much a virgin territory when we first decided to enter about 6-7 years ago. And so it's not a coincidence that we entered in India and in Australia, because those were the markets either where the government had very clear targets and a roadmap for renewables penetration in terms of, say, India, where they announced a very aggressive rollout of national auctions. And we can go into the topic of auctions also in Vietnam later. And in the case of Australia, it was a very liquid market, but also a liberalized market that gave us the confidence of playing a relevant role, not only on the generation side, but more recently also on the retail. We have a geothermal concession, for example, in Indonesia, but I think the big impetus for us was in places like Korea and in Vietnam, where they introduced very interesting regulatory signals for renewables, for wind and for solar. In the case of Korea, there was a couple of years ago, finally, a government policy that allowed for long-term renewable energy offtake contracts that made projects finally bankable. And then in the case of Vietnam, we've had these feed-in tariffs, and now we're seeing also another very interesting a movement in terms of a gradual unbundling, liberalization of the sector, but also in terms of allowing for direct electricity sales to final customers, and now we're seeing also signs of auctions. So I would say we have been Enel has always been looking at projects at markets rather that have a very interesting mix of the endowment of natural resources that allow for renewables, a very robust demand in those internal markets, and probably equally important, the regulatory and the market scheme that allows us to make those investments. And Vietnam in the past few years had kind of fit that category for us, that gave us the confidence to enter and start investing in a pipeline of projects that we're currently developing. We are staying away from the offshore market, at least for the time being, because our focus has been on projects that have a shorter lead time to investment. So normally we would like to invest in projects that once we make the investment decision, we can see the projects in operation in 18 to 24 months. And because the technology landscape in this field is progressing so quickly, we didn't want to take investments that have a longer lead time horizon. And there's enough opportunities on the onshore side of wind, but also on solar, and somebody else mentioned in the other renewables technology that we're also very competitive, hydro, geothermal, maybe even some biomass. So I would say our main focus has been on onshore wind and on solar, both floating PV, but also onshore PV. For me, I think the primary challenge is going to be on the upgrading of their network infrastructure, namely on the high voltage side, because already their integration of renewables has accumulated such a capacity. And their transmission network is still geared towards centralized fossil fuel plants. So that's going to have to be upgraded. We've already seen significant curtailment, particularly on the solar projects that were installed in the southern and the central regions of the country, which was even made worse by the depression in demand due to COVID. So the only way they're going to be able to get out of this conundrum is to really upgrade and probably also have some interconnectors tying it with other markets. And I think Bundit made a very interesting observation about the potential of connection between Vietnam and Laos. So I think it's going to be a connection of building out their transmission infrastructure, and also having some regulatory regimes that will allow for the balancing to happen, whether it's introduction of ancillary services that is nascent, but also probably also incentivizing private investment in the transmission, because we're talking about about more than $40 billion of investments that need to be that according to some study that needs to happen in order for Vietnam to absorb the amount of renewables that it needs. So I think the government cannot do it alone. So I think there's going to be a lot of focus and so that we can get this obstacle out of the way that will allow a more steady and a more, say, ambitious growth on the renewable side. We've also seen the penetration of renewables play out in many different markets over the past 10, 20 years. And it's interesting to see, some common patterns. For example, I started my career in Enel Power in the United States. And there we also had, it's not a feed-in tariff, but something a little bit similar where we had a government subsidy in the form of a tax credit. And those tax credits were extended on very short time horizons by the US Congress. And having those short-term extensions led to a very volatile peak and valley of capacity additions. And I think we've seen that in Vietnam over the past 2-3 years, both on the solar side and on the wind side. So the good thing is that it showed that the industry responds to signals, and that such dramatic capacity additions can happen. So as you know, in the past 2 years, in Vietnam, they added about 9 gigawatts of utility scale solar, another 9 gigawatts of distributed solar. And this year alone, they added almost 4 gigawatts of onshore wind. So while this is very impressive, it also shows that after that cliff is met, then you tend to have a valley, and that creates a lot of inefficiencies. So I think, one lesson that we can probably learn from these cases is that it's very important that we have long-term goals and targets that are set by government that gives the confidence of the industry to manage this growth in a more, I would say, balanced way. Seven or eight, we were actually pretty close to making our first investment this year, targeting the DPPA scheme, and this is the direct PPA scheme, which is selling to final customers. Because a lot of the manufacturers that are in Vietnam are already our global offtake customers in other markets. And so we had been in advanced negotiations with some of them, and we had some projects in our pipeline that we could have probably executed. But as you know, all of these schemes were, the launch of these schemes were delayed. So we're hopeful that we can get at least one of these projects off the ground in the first half of next year. 7 or 8 out of 10, I would say.